Okay. Okay, today we are going to begin the book of Joshua. This basically serves as the completion of the story first begun way back in Genesis, when God first came to Abraham and promised him that his descendants would settle into a land someday, which ends up being this land, the land of Canaan, east of the Mediterranean Sea. The works of Moses are complete in their own right as a unit of 5 books, the Pentateuch. They contain the Torah, the instruction, the law, but they do not finish the story of the Israelites actually taking the land. That is left hanging, sort of like a cliffhanger. Moses goes up to the mountain on the other side of the Jordan, outside the Promised Land, looks upon the Promised Land and dies without going in. And the Israelites are still on the other side of the Jordan River as well. So we had to finish the story of getting them in there, and that's what the book of Joshua is. The book of Joshua does not have any more laws or instruction for the people. That is complete. That is the unit. There will not be any more instructions or laws to the people once they go into the land. David in his day and Solomon will set a new precedent when they switch the worship system from a tabernacle to a temple. And David himself will not build a temple, his son Solomon will, but David will kind of set up a new religious system or a new worship system based on the temple rather than the tabernacle. But other than that, and of course Solomon will have his proverbs and things along those lines, but the instructions themselves are complete. The Constitution of Israel, as defined in the covenant written out by Moses and established between Moses and God and the people and Moses and in the days of Moses, that's finished. So the Pentateuch, the Moses' books of the Old Testament are set off by themselves as a complete unit. But they do not finish the story of the Israelites claiming the land. That is left to Joshua to do. So Joshua is going to do that. There's going to be 2 parts to this book. It's kind of like Exodus in that regards. Exodus, if you recall, the Exodus itself happens fairly early in Exodus. They're out of Egypt by about Exodus 15 or so. Exodus is 40 chapters long. They get the 10 Commandments in chapter Exodus 20. And the Exodus has already happened by then. So the Exodus itself only covers the first half of the book of Exodus. The second half of the book of Exodus is about their time at Sinai and all the things that go on there. In fact, they didn't even leave Sinai until halfway through Numbers. Joshua is similar. Joshua is also split up into halves. The first half of the book will be a discussion or a recap of their actual taking of the land. Some events are going to be described in decent detail, and a lot later on are going to be summarized. But that will only cover about half of the book of Joshua. The second half of the book of Joshua is going to be about them divvying up the land and assigning it to their tribes and their territories. And those tribal assignments are going to remain consistent throughout most of their history. We read about in the law how every 50th year the tribal, whatever buying and selling you do of your land, or your estates, or whatever, is supposed to reset back to the starting point every 50 years in their history. With some exceptions, it was possible for some territories to permanently get sold off to the Levites or whatever. But for the most part, every 50 years, all debts were canceled and all land assignments resetted back to the way they were in the days of Joshua when they first came into the land. So that's going to be the second half of the book of Joshua. That's going to be much more boring than the first half. That's not going to be, we're going to read it. We're going to get through it all. Like we got through Exodus, like we got through Leviticus. The second half of Joshua is not going to be very exciting to our modern ears, but we are going to cover it. The first half will be pretty good, though. Most people are familiar with the story in the first half of Joshua. This is one of the more controversial parts of the Bible because of its content. It does involve sanctioned warfare, sanctioned killing. In fact, commanded warfare, commanded killing. God is going to command Joshua and the Israelite armies to destroy people. And so there is a certain amount of controversy that goes along with that, and then of course the controversy of whether or not this actually happened. I believe it did. This would be about 1406. This book would be starting about 1406 BC. The Exodus happened, I believe, in 1446 BC, give or take a year or two. This is 40 years later, so now we're down to approximately 1406 BC. It's hard to say exactly how long all the events in Joshua took, or how long it took them to conquer the land. Probably a number of years. Probably not too terribly long, but probably a number of years. So and then of course Joshua dies at the end of the book of Joshua. So we're talking about a time period that lasts probably from about 1406 BC, where it starts, to maybe 1380 or 1375 BC, when Joshua might die. We really don't know. But I do believe these events happened as Joshua describes. The thing you have to remember, we'll talk about some of these incidents in more detail as we get to them individually. No one is disputing that these cities were destroyed. Jericho was destroyed. It was rebuilt eventually later. Ai was destroyed. The cities later on mentioned. No one is disputing that. Like, no one is disputing that these cities were destroyed. The problem comes in where people say that they were destroyed at a time before the Israelites got there. And our problem then becomes, well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier when we were talking about the Exodus and the Pharaohs of Egypt and all that. We have our dates mixed up. We don't have our dates in the proper synchrony with each other. And we think, I'm sorry, my cat is on the warpath again here. Well, not yet. She just woke up from her morning nap, so she's still coming to, which, oh, there she goes. She's starting to get into it now. So, for example, many of the smart people will tell you that the Israelites came into the land in the 11 or 1200s BC, at which time these cities were already destroyed, had already been destroyed for some time. So there was nothing for them to do. When they came into the land, there were no cities for them to destroy. Well, that's because, that's not because that these events didn't happen. It's because we have our timetables messed up. We think the Israelites came into the land in the 1200s BC, and they were actually there 200 plus years earlier, and that's when these events happened, which, according to smart people, is the same time these cities were actually destroyed. We just we don't put these things together. Part of it is because we simply made mistakes back in the day when we were originally compiling our information and our data and our timelines and our charts. We made mistakes. Everyone had kind of accepted these mistakes as being accurate and truthful. And now, 50, 60 years later, we're so hardened. We've got that so deeply baked into our teaching and our worldview and our materials. We don't want to go back and change it. It'd be a hassle for one thing. All those dates and all those materials, all those displays we have in all of our museums and all of our textbooks, we have to be altered. It's a hassle. We don't really want to go through the hassle of doing that. And we have to admit that we are wrong. And we don't want to do that either. That's just something we don't want to do, especially if it means admitting that the Bible was right. We don't want to do that either. We never want to do that. That is something that we're going to hold off on doing as long as we possibly can. And so in the end, and we'll talk about these examples more in depth as we get to them as we read through the book, but in the end, that is really what the problem is. Not that we don't believe the events happened, we just don't believe they happened in this order at this time frame, But that's more of a problem with our timelines and our timetables that we have written and established that we think are true when they're not. And instead of going back and carefully considering whether or not Kathleen Kenyon, for example, made mistakes when she dated Jericho back in the 50s, instead of doing that, we just assume the Bible has to be wrong and that our dates have to be right. And so that creates conflict and tension. That doesn't really need to be there, but we don't want to go through the hassle of changing all of our materials that we've published or written over the last 70 years. We certainly don't want to risk the embarrassment of saying that we were wrong, and we don't want to have to say the Bible was right. These are all things we really just don't want to do, so we just kind of let things slide. We just kind of let it go on, and we let the misconceptions and mistakes and misapprehensions just continue piling on each other. And that's just what we do. We're seeing it with COVID now, too. If you don't think this can happen, if you don't think human nature actually works this way, just look at what's happening with COVID around us right now. It's a clear example of this going on in real time right in front of our eyes. But again, because we just simply don't want to think about it, don't want to talk about it, don't want to acknowledge it, we don't say anything about it. But it's obvious to anybody who's actually looking. I'm going to go ahead and start a new video. That was the introduction to Joshua.